Welcome. My name is Lynn Nygaard. I'm the director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture, and we're delighted to welcome Dr. Molly Crockett to the CMBC and to Emory. Dr. Crockett is currently an associate professor of psychology at Yale University, but she'll be joining the Princeton's Department of Psychology and University Center for Human Values this coming summer, 2022. Prior to her time at Yale, Dr. Crockett was an associate professor of experimental psychology and a fellow of Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Dr. Crockett received her PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Cambridge and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich and a Wellcome Trust postdoctoral fellowship at University College London. Dr. Crockett has won too many awards and honors for me to list, but I will say that she's the recent recipient of the Janet Taylor Spence Award for transformative early career contributions from the Association for Psychological Science and the Distinguished Scientific Award for early career contributions to social psychology from the American Psychological Association. Dr. Crockett's research investigates how people learn and make decisions in social situations, exploring the neurocognitive foundations of morality, altruism, trust, and punishment. Her interdisciplinary approach integrates theory and methods from social, cognitive, clinical, and developmental psychology, computational neuroscience, behavioral economics, philosophy, and data science. The title of Dr. Crockett's talk today is Digital Outrage, Mechanisms and Consequences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Molly Crockett. Thank you so much, Molly.
Thank you for the really kind introduction. And let me just get my screen shared here. All right, can everyone see that? Great, I see heads nodding. So it's really great to be here. I was just saying to Lynn before you all came in, this is a very delayed visit due to COVID, but the upside of that is that the work is a lot more developed now than when I was originally invited. So I'm going to be sharing a lot of new unpublished stuff. There's probably more material here than I'll be able to get through in the time we have. So I'll appreciate your patience and looking forward to seeing what you all think. In October 2021, the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, leaked thousands of internal documents to Congress and the press. One of the many things we learned from the Facebook papers, as they were called, is that Facebook's newsfeed algorithm prioritized angry reactions 5 times above other types of reactions and facilitated the spread of toxic, polarizing, and false content on the platform. These findings were uncovered by internal research at the company, hidden from the public, and ultimately exploited to prioritize company profits over public safety. Testifying before the British Parliament, Haugen said, "Anger and hate is the easiest way to grow on Facebook." The CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, described the Facebook papers as a coordinated effort to selectively use leaked documents to paint a false picture of our company. And since those papers came out, it has neither confirmed or denied their contents. Reading these headlines back in October was a pretty weird experience for me personally, because I had spent the past 5 years researching similar questions about outrage and toxicity on social media with very little help and sometimes active obstruction from social media companies, as I will share with you today. So I'm going to tell you the story of that research today, how it began, what we found so far, where we're going next, and how I'm currently thinking about the relationship between academic researchers and private companies. In the first part of the talk, I will develop a theory of moral outrage in the digital age, explaining how social media technology exploits social learning systems to amplify moral outrage expressions over time. Next, I'll share how we developed new tools for measuring moral outrage expressions on social media and how we use these tools to test our theory. In the third part of the talk, I'll describe some new work that explores some of the consequences of outrage amplification, including the spread of misinformation, the misperception of collective attitudes, and the spread of hate speech and harassment. And finally, I'll conclude with just some brief reflections on the ethical and policy implications of these findings. And as Lynn said, I will pause periodically to take some clarification questions, but I'm sure there will be lots and lots of discussion of big picture stuff, so we'll leave that till then. Okay. I've been studying moral outrage for many years, since I was a PhD student, and there's of course a really large literature on this topic. So broadly, we can consider moral outrage as anger and disgust at the violation of a moral standard. There's evidence that moral outrage leads to a desire to shame and punish the wrongdoer, and in an intergroup context, it motivates collective action to achieve in-group goals. Outrage is also effective in enforcing social norms, in the sense that being the target of outrage makes you more likely to comply with those norms. A lot of my own work on outrage and punishment has focused on their proximate mechanisms. Building on philosophical theories that distinguish between consequentialist and retributive approaches to punishment, work by John Darley and others on the psychology of retributive justice, I've investigated the degree to which punishment behaviors are motivated by consequentialist motives to deter future harms versus retributive motives to make transgressors suffer. I developed a paradigm that can measure these motives independently, and found that both consequentialist and retributive motives are present in adults and also in children as young as age 4. But while people are quite willing to publicly endorse punishing for consequentialist reasons, they're generally unwilling to admit punishing for retributive reasons, even though their behavior shows otherwise. So in other words, people tend to punish in large part because they're motivated to see transgressors suffer, but the story they often tell themselves and others is that they punish to prevent harm in the future. I had sort of wrapped up most of my work on punishment around 2014, and I'd moved on to other kinds of research questions. But I was living in the UK at the time. Brexit happened, and then Trump was elected. The media actually declared 2016 the age of outrage, which is kind of cute if you think about everything that happened since 2016. But anyway, at the time, I found myself just spending quite a lot of time on social media and getting really sucked into these cycles of feeling outraged and sharing a bunch of articles, getting a lot of positive social feedback for that, spending even more time online, feeling generally horrible about everything. And at some point, I started thinking about how the incentive structures of social media might be sucking us in, changing the way we engage politically and express our outrage to others. And I started getting curious about maybe if this was something that could be studied from a psychological perspective. So what's special about social media? Online social networks don't just enable us to communicate with each other. They also provide us with quantitative measures of where we stand in our social networks, which is pretty unfortunate if you have any level of social anxiety. We can see how many friends and followers we all have. We can keep track of how much others are liking what we say and do, literally. Researchers have shown that these social rewards are highly motivating, so we can expect likes and shares to function as reinforcers. And research has shown that moral expressions like outrage are particularly likely to get this kind of social engagement. We also know from neuroimaging studies of moralistic punishment that a frontostriatal circuitry, including striatal structures and lateral prefrontal cortex, becomes more activated when people punish moral violations compared to when they turn the other cheek. And this brain circuitry, of course, overlaps with the circuitry for basic instrumental reward learning. And also, as a recent study showed, craving social connections when we've been socially isolated. So you have the convergence of all of these neural systems for social cognition, for learning and decision-making based on rewards, for punishment. And all of these insights sort of led me to speculate that reinforcement learning processes and the rewards of social connection could teach people over time to express more outrage on social media. So very, very broad strokes. You've got moral outrage that's triggered by a stimulus, calling attention to some sort of moral norm violation. People then express outrage with a range of responses, like sending messages or sharing the messages of others. Now, we know then that expressing moral outrage makes you look good to other people. You're seen as more moral and trustworthy. And so because of this, we can expect moral outrage expressions to get high numbers of likes and shares on social media. And these positive outcomes then reinforce the outrage responses. And through this process, we can expect expressions of outrage to increase over time on social media. We might also expect these expressions to become more habit-like over time as they're repeatedly reinforced, because these rewards are delivered at unpredictable times, which is a pattern of reward delivery known as variable reinforcement that we know promotes habit formation. So casinos use this kind of reward delivery to keep gamblers hooked on slot machines. And so this is going to come up later in the talk. Because habits are behaviors that are expressed without concern for their consequences, you might have, just as someone who's snacking out of habit is reaching for a bag of chips without feeling hungry, people might be expressing outrage online without necessarily feeling that emotion deeply or thinking about the long-term consequences of expressing it. Now, as psychologists, we're used to thinking about reinforcement learning as an individual level process, right? You have an individual learner who's emitting responses and receiving feedback that reinforces those responses, making them more likely in the future. But reinforcement learning alone is unlikely to fully explain the dynamics of online moral outrage expression and social learning, because we need to know what happens when these individual learners are embedded within social networks. And we need to be asking how properties of those networks might influence the type of feedback that individuals receive and how they respond to that feedback. So in addition to looking at reinforcement learning processes, we're also looking at a process we call norm learning. It's similar to conformity, right? People might match their expressions to what they infer is normative among their peers through observation. So you can imagine that different social networks might vary in their overall levels of outrage being expressed. And newcomers to the network will observe this and then adjust their expressions to the group norm. So as outrage propagates through social networks, individuals might be learning through observation that outrage expression is more or less appropriate for their network, and then become more or less likely to express outrage in the future, independently from what their sort of local reward and non-reward profile is looking like. Now, crucially, we might also predict that reinforcement learning and norm learning processes could interact, because past work has shown that when individuals can directly observe which actions are most valuable, they rely less on this sort of model-free reinforcement learning process. So we might predict that moral outrage expressions might be guided more by norm learning than reinforcement learning, especially when outrage is really normative or salient in a social network. Okay, so putting all of these observations together, our theory suggests the following hypotheses. First, that individual users will learn to express more outrage over time on social media. Second, that positive social feedback for outrage expressions will increase the likelihood of future outrage expressions. This is the reinforcement learning hypothesis. Third, that people will conform their outrage expressions to the expressive norms of their social networks. That's the norm learning hypothesis. And finally, the interaction, that norm learning will overshadow reinforcement learning when normative information is readily observable in the network. Okay, so to test these hypotheses, we needed to build a new tool to be able to measure moral outrage expressions in social media text. Moral outrage is, of course, like a complex social emotional expression. So existing tools for sentiment analysis weren't going to cut it. So this was like a 3-year project, and it was led by Billy Brady, who is just about to start an assistant professor position at Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. Killian McLaughlin, who started out as a lab tech in my lab and is now doing his PhD in my lab. Tuan Duan, who is an undergrad at Yale, is now working at Quora in San Francisco. And together we built a machine learning classifier that can automatically detect moral outrage expressions in social media texts. So I'm just going to walk you through the sort of high level description of how we went about building this classifier. So supervised machine learning requires a training set, right? So some labeled data that you can use to teach the algorithm what counts as outrage and what doesn't. So we trained our classifier using a data set of 26,000 hand-labeled tweets from a variety of episodes of viral public outrage that we grabbed from Twitter. And these were episodes that engaged a range of different ideologies. So we wanted our classifier to be really generalizable. So we needed outrage from liberals, from conservatives, from both, neither. So we got outrage from mostly liberals about Trump's transgender military ban, outrage from mostly conservatives about actor Jussie Smollett's alleged fake altercation with Trump supporters, outrage from both liberals and conservatives about the Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings, and about a viral video about students from Covington Catholic High School in Kentucky, which you might remember from a couple of years ago. An episode of non-political outrage where United Airlines violently dragged a passenger off an overbooked flight. So we have effectively a little time capsule here of public outrage episodes, and we have these tweets. And then we used instructions that we developed very carefully based on social psychological theory to train humans, a group of humans, to recognize moral outrage expressions in tweets. And then they labeled by hand all 26,000 as to whether they contain outrage or not. This was crowdsourced, so we're not having like one person read 26,000 tweets. That would be way too much. Each tweet is being labeled by 10 annotators, 5 liberals, 5 conservatives, who have pretty high agreement on what counts as outrage or not. Okay, so with these labeled data then, we use supervised machine learning to build a deep neural net classifier, which we call the digital outrage classifier. And the software can automatically detect outrage expressions in social media text. And we can basically feed in millions of tweets, and it will then determine the probability that any given tweet expresses outrage or not. So here are a couple of examples of tweets categorized by our classifier. These tweets come from the Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings. This is an outrage tweet. And this is a non-outrage tweet. Our classifier achieves classification accuracy of about 76%, which is about the agreement that humans agree with one another. So that's about as good as you can do. An F1 score of 0.74 if you are in the lingo of machine learning world. We have made this software freely available to academic researchers. It's on our lab's GitHub. And you can find more information about it in the published paper. Okay, to test our hypotheses about moral outrage and social learning, we needed to construct data sets that had tweet histories of individual users. So we first identify users who were likely to be, tweeting about these political issues. And so we identify users who appear in our training sets of tweets. And we wanted to be able to compare users with higher versus lower levels of political engagement. So specifically, we identified high political engagement users as users who had tweeted about the Kavanaugh hearings. And we identified less politically engaged users from people who had tweeted about the United Airlines incident. All the results I'm going to show you replicate in both of these data sets. So nothing that I'm going to show you is really specific to people who tweet about politics. But there are some interesting differences, particularly when it comes to norm learning between these two groups. Okay. So we identify these users. There's about 3,600 users in each of these groups. And then we collect their history of tweets up to 3,000 tweets per user, which is how far back in time the Twitter API goes. So we end up getting a total of about 12 million tweets. And then we feed all these tweets through our classifier so we can tell the probability that each one contains outrage. We also then have information about how many likes and retweets each original tweet in the set receives. And so we're applying the outrage classifier. And so we have this data set on which we can test for these reinforcement learning trajectories. So to recap, our first hypothesis, very basic. This is not like fancy, sophisticated theory. This is just like one of the most well-known facts about biology, right? If you reward an action, it increases in time. So we are going to analyze the data from individual users' tweet histories, and we built time-lagged regression models to test the hypothesis that the more your social network rewards you for expressing outrage specifically with likes and shares, the more likely you then become to express outrage in the future. So in other words, we look at the social feedback you get from yesterday's outrage tweets, and this feedback should be positively associated with the amount of outrage you express today. And in these models, we're also controlling for autocorrelation between previous outrage expression and current outrage expression, because as it turns out, those are positively correlated within users over time. So as we predicted in both data sets, we find a positive relationship between the previous day's outrage-specific social feedback and the current day's outrage expression. The effect size translates to an expected 2 to 3% increase in outrage expression on the following day for every 100% increase in feedback for expressing outrage on a given day. So just to take a concrete hypothetical example, if you have a user who's on average getting 5 likes or shares per tweet, and then tweets something especially spicy and gets 10 likes or shares, that's a 100% increase. That's going to increase their outrage expression on the next day by 2 to 3%. So this is a really small effect size. I want to make that clear, but it can very, very easily scale on social media over time, especially at the network level, and especially for users who have a larger followership, right? So like the more followers you have on Twitter or Facebook, the more volatility there's going to be in the feedback you get, because your tweets are potentially being shown to a very, very wide audience indeed. A few other findings that are worth highlighting for sort of theoretical purposes. We find prediction error signaling effects. So, one feature of reinforcement learning theories is that you're particularly learning from events that are better or worse than expected, right? So on Twitter, you can only really get positive feedback. So we can look at positive prediction errors when you get more likes or shares than you've been getting on average. And it turns out that in particular, if you have a positive prediction error in the amount of feedback you get for an outrage tweet, this has an especially high impact on your increase in tweeting in the future. We also find that previous outrage expression positively predicts current expression, independent of any reinforcement learning processes, which is kind of interesting because at some point in the online discourse, especially right after the election of Trump, there were discussions about like, is there such a thing as outrage fatigue? Like, if you're expressing outrage all the time, do you like peter out eventually? And our data suggests no, that actually there's a positive correlation in time between outrage expression at time 1 and time 2, putting feedback aside. As to whether this reflects like actual emotional responses, I think we'll get to that a little bit later in the talk. Finally, one classic finding in reinforcement learning is that RL effects on behavior tend to diminish over time, right, as the relationships between actions and outcomes are learned. And so in these data, we find that the reinforcement learning effects are smaller and users that have longer reinforcement histories. So what might be happening here is that like when you first join Twitter, you don't really know what kinds of tweets get you a lot of engagement or not, and there's like a learning curve, and there's potentially an asymptote there. Okay, so next we want to test a hypothesis that norm learning can separately impact outrage expressions. So we approach this question in 2 steps. We first reasoned that in the context of the political topics we study here, outrage expression should be more prevalent in social networks populated by more ideologically extreme users. And this logic is just based on a lot of evidence that ideological extremity predicts outrage expression in a variety of contexts. So more specifically, we predicted that if you take an individual user and you look at the ideological extremity of their network, this should be associated with outrage expression of that user over and above how politically extreme or moderate they are themselves. So we use a tool developed by Pablo Barbera to measure the political ideology of all of the users in our data set, and also all of the people who those users are connected to, like all of their friends and all of their followers. So this ends up with a total of 6.28 million friends and followers for users in the Kavanaugh data set, and 21 million friends and followers for our users in the United data set. So we estimate the ideological extremity of all of those folks. And then we can look at what the networks look like for the users in our data set. So here I'm plotting the network level ideological extremity for the Kavanaugh and United data sets. And as we would expect, the folks who are tweeting about the political topic of the Kavanaugh hearings do show more ideological extremity. The folks who are tweeting about the United incident are in networks that are much more ideologically moderate. But there is, as you can see, substantial variation in this network extremity. So we exploited this variability to test whether people are more likely to express outrage in networks that have more ideologically extreme members. Again, statistically controlling for your own level of ideological extremity. So holding constant, you're setting aside how politically extreme you are. If your network is more ideologically extreme, you are more likely to be expressing outrage. So this is some evidence for conformity, for norm learning. And finally, we're looking at whether these 2 types of learning processes interact. So one key prediction is that if you're in a network that's ideologically extreme and there's a lot of outrage around, you can get information that is normative without having to rely on the direct rewards from reinforcement learning. So to test this, we're basically taking our time-lagged regression models, looking at the reinforcement learning effects. That's going to be plotted on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is going to be the network level ideological extremity for our 2 groups of participants. And so as you can see, for the more ideological extreme networks, the reliance on the social reinforcement learning is reduced. And for those who are in less ideologically extreme networks, they're relying more on the direct reinforcement. Okay, so these are big data sets, naturalistic, observational, but they're correlational, right? So like we can't make any causal claims from these data. And we couldn't directly measure users' perceptions of what's good or bad to post in the network either. So to supplement these observational studies, we ran a couple of experiments where we created a simulated Twitter environment and directly manipulated both social feedback for outrage expressions as well as network level norms of outrage expressions. The way this works is participants are randomly assigned to a network that contained a high or low frequency of outrage tweets. So there's the outrage norm condition and the neutral norm condition, and they're sort of scrolling through this simulated Twitter feed. We actually used real tweets that we had harvested from the Twitter data sets and then sorted according to their outrage level with our classifier. So subjects in the outrage norm condition are scrolling through a lot of outragey tweets, and those in the neutral norm condition are scrolling through a lot of neutral tweets. And then we present them with a choice. We give them, we say, you have to choose between 2 tweets, and your goal is to maximize the number of likes you get in this social network. So these tweets, crucially, they're choosing again between a high and a low outrage tweet. So we can then see whether, even before they receive any feedback, are they more likely to choose an outrage tweet when they're in the outrage norm condition? And then also, can they learn from the positive feedback that we give according to condition? So here are what those data look like. And you can see evidence for norm learning on the first trial. So even before subjects receive any feedback, participants are more likely to select the norm consistent tweet. So what I'm plotting here is people who choose the outrage tweet in the outrage norm condition and the neutral tweet in the neutral norm condition. So on the very first trial, you can see conformity effects, but then also you see a learning curve over time where people come to choose the more rewarded type of response. And then you can see also from the difference of these slopes that there's an interaction, just like we see in our observational studies, where the reinforcement learning effect, the steepness of that slope, is weaker in the network where outrage is more common, probably because outrage norms are just much more salient in that condition. All right, to summarize so far, social reinforcement of outrage in online social networks is associated with increased outrage expressions over time. Outrage expressions are sensitive to expressive norms in users' social networks over and above users' own ideological extremity. And finally, reinforcement learning of outrage expressions is weaker in networks where outrage is more common. Okay, now might be a good time to pause and take questions that are specifically about like the classifier, how we're measuring outrage, because all of the findings I'm going to present in the next part of the talk are going to build on what I just presented in the first part.
Are you going to talk more about norm learning later in the talk?
Indirectly, I think.
Okay. I was just wondering if you found anything surprising with norm learning across both ideological groups, because around the same timeline, 2015, 2016, I noticed that everyone seemed outraged about everything. Mm-hmm. And as an ethicist, it just, to me, it didn't seem like it mattered which ideological group. Mm-hmm. It didn't seem compatible with what I knew about ethics and norms. So I used values synonymously. And it was like, I was like, you're allowed to have those hot button, values that are really going to push your buttons, but you're not allowed to just claim like, this outrages me, this outrages me. And that's what I started seeing more. So
I love this question. And I want to come back to it at the end of the talk, because I think I'm going to present some more data that will speak to this.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to zoom through unless there's any other.
There is a question in the chat.
Let me see.
Is moral political?
Yeah, so I think like moral is a broader category than political, exactly. So the reason why we really wanted to have users from both the United incident as well as the Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings is that we wanted both the tool that we built, as well as the effects that we were studying in the learning experiments to generalize beyond political issues, right? Like, we think that this is something very general about moral outrage expression that is often applied to political issues on social media, but need not always.
I think that's it.
Oh, I see another hand.
Oh,
Yeah, maybe you don't want to go to it in detail, but I was wondering, how did you then train your algorithm to detect moral but not political versus political outrage? And it's fine if you don't want to get into that right
No,
now.
so this is why we included a lot of different incidents, right? So the more variety of training tweets we put in the labeled data set that we use to train the algorithm, the more generalizable the software can be. And so the united tweets in particular were like really, really important for achieving that generalizability beyond the political topics. And at this point, we've used the classifier to classify, lots of different types of tweets, for a variety of different like non-political issues, and also hate speech, which I'm gonna hopefully have time to present. But yeah, you're right. Okay, if anyone else has questions, you can type them in the chat, and it's actually pretty easy for me to see the chat and just make a snap decision about whether that's a now question or a later question. So if anything pops up, feel free to do that. Okay, so why should we care if outrage is amplified online? A few reasons that we've explored in our recent work. First, we wanted to look at the role of outrage in spreading misinformation. Second, we've been looking at whether there is a misperception of how outraged people actually are when they express outrage online. And finally, we're worried about the capacity of outrage expressions because they're so engaging and so likely to go viral. Do they have the capacity to facilitate the spread of hate speech and harassment online? So we'll see how many of these we get through. Right, so I'm sure we're all aware by now that over the past few years, there's been an explosion of misinformation online, which is defined as biased, misleading, or factually incorrect news. So from the 2020 election, contested results, to all of the misinformation around COVID-19, to the Capitol riots in January 2021, there are just like all sorts of examples of misinformation polluting the digital public sphere. Now, to get a handle on this, psychologists have been asking why people share misinformation. And to answer this question, we might consider why people share information in the first place. So, if we go back to Grice and sort of, classic communication theories, one of the main reasons people communicate is because they want to be accurate, they want to be relevant. And so if you think about the informational goals of communication, this perspective casts misinformation sharing as a failure of reflecting on the accuracy of the information. So this perspective, which has been led by Gordon Pennycook and David Rand, the idea is that like people are just not really paying enough attention. The reason that they share misinformation is because they're just like distracted, they're not thinking really that hard, and so if you just nudge people to be more accurate, then you could slow or stop the spread of information. And they've been gathering evidence for that perspective. However, people aren't just motivated to be accurate when they share information, right? People are also motivated by social goals. They want to share information that's going to win them friends and influence in their social group, regardless of whether that information is true or not. Right? There's a trade-off here. And this perspective suggests that people might share information because they want to signal something about their commitment to their in-group, right? And so there have been some recent studies suggesting that, in addition to or over and above, like, just being distracted, like some people share misinformation very deliberately just because they want to be, they want to participate in political discourse with their group. So we bring to this debate a proposal that outrage mediates the extent to which people pursue these informational versus social goals. And specifically, we suggest that when misinformation evokes outrage, it drives people's attention towards group identity signaling and away from considering accuracy, because we know that one important function of outrage is reputational signaling. So if you were a designer of misinformation, you'd ideally want to engineer it to evoke the most outrage, to discourage people from caring about accuracy and to facilitate its spread. Our theoretical framework suggests 4 hypotheses. First, that misinformation evokes more outrage than factually accurate news. Second, that outrage evoking misinformation receives more engagement, facilitating its spread. Third, that misinformation evokes more outrage than other types of emotions. And fourth, that outrage increases engagement with misinformation by making people prioritize reputational over informational goals. And we tested these hypotheses across a few different studies on Twitter and Facebook. Now, before I share the results, if you'll indulge me in a brief interlude. According to Haugen's leaked Facebook papers, all of our hypotheses about misinformation and outrage, it turns out, were also being actively investigated by Facebook at the same time as we were pursuing our research questions. We had actually submitted a proposal describing our plans in 2018 to an initiative called Social Science One. This was a partnership between Facebook and academia to provide independent, credible research about the role of social media in the world. And Facebook got a lot of credit for this initiative. They were praised for their transparency and willingness to work with researchers on questions about misinformation and democracy. Our proposal was awarded in early 2019. We waited about a year to get the data from Facebook. We worked on this data for another 2 years or so. And then in September 2021, Facebook notified all of the research teams that 70% of the promised data had actually accidentally been omitted from the data set. And so all of the analyses that we had done up until that point were basically invalid. And so we had to start over almost completely from scratch. And so this was September 2021. The announcement of the Facebook papers less than a month later, not only had Facebook sent us flawed data, they also already knew the results of a lot of the research that we had been working on because they'd done it themselves secretly. And that just kind of added insult to injury. My poor PhD student had been working on this for 2 years nonstop, basically. And that was a big setback. So luckily, our research ended up painting a much richer picture about misinformation sharing than Facebook's own internal research. So let's go back to the results. Our Twitter data showed that responses to misinformation indeed contained more expressions of moral outrage than responses to factually accurate news. So here I'm plotting the results from a regression comparing misinformation, tweets containing links to misinformation versus legitimate news, and in retweets, replies, and all responses, they're getting more expressions of outrage. And in addition, moral outrage expressions were significantly associated with increased engagement with misinformation, much more than authentic news, as it turned out. So these results suggest that in Twitter, outrage expressions were significantly associated with increased engagement. So that's supporting the first hypothesis that outrage can facilitate the spread of fake news. When we went to the Facebook data, we are looking at the sharing of URLs and emotional expressions associated with these. And we focus on a set of URLs that were matched to the study 1 data in time and in the URLs. So we're basically trying to do, to the extent possible, a direct replication of the study 1 findings on Twitter with Facebook data. Now, one thing that's really special and unique about this Facebook data is it's differentially private, which basically means that there's random noise added on top of it so that you can't identify individual users from the data set. This ends up creating some sort of new challenges with the statistics. So some of the statistical approaches that we took with this data had to be adapted for working with differentially private data. We're also on Facebook not able to use our outrage classifier. So instead we're looking at Facebook's emotion reactions. So this includes sort of sad, wow, haha, love, and anger. And you know, we're going to be equating the anger reactions on Facebook with outrage on Twitter, not because outrage and anger are the same, but we expect that a lot of the variance in outrage expressions would also be captured by anger expressions. Okay. So we wanted to ask a few questions with these data on Facebook. We wanted to see is misinformation, so links to fake news websites, associated more strongly with angry reactions compared to any of these other reactions relative to links to legitimate news sites. Second, we have data in this data set whether people shared an article without reading it first. So this allows us to ask a really interesting question, which came up in the theory at the beginning about habits and whether outrage is associated with this sort of like mindless kind of behavior. So the first question, whether misinformation links receive more angry expressions than factually accurate links, is very strongly supported in the data. And also comparing it to the other emotion reactions, the only emotion that comes close to differentiating between fake and legitimate news links is the haha reaction. All of the other emotions are much lower. So anger is associated with misinformation over and above other emotional reactions. Next, we're looking at whether outrage evoking misinformation is associated with more what we call mindless sharing. So sharing without reading it first. And what we find, again, is this is for misinformation. Misinformation is predicting sharing without clicking through more than twice the extent for misinformation links than for factually accurate news. So what this is suggesting is that when misinformation news links on Facebook generate a particularly high number of angry reactions, those articles are also likely to be propagating throughout the network without people reading through the article first. So that, in our view, is support for the idea that that outrage facilitates sharing of fake news for reasons that are not directly tied to the truth value of the information. I see a chat question. I'm not quite sure I understand it though, so I'm going to keep going and we can come back to it because we're getting close to time and I want to get through the last of these findings. So functional democracies require that we all have an accurate shared understanding about one another's moral attitudes on political issues. And because social media decouples the expression of outrage from its experience, you might appear outraged on social media without actually feeling it yourself. And so people might falsely believe that others are more outraged than they actually are. So this is what we call misperception of individual outrage. Exacerbating this problem further, our news feeds are not representative of the entire network. But our minds might make inferences as if they are representative. So if you imagine a network where a minority of individuals express outrage about some issue, these posts are going to get a lot of engagement. And so they're more likely to show up in the news feed. And so then individual users might infer that more people in the network are outraged and that those individuals are more outraged than they actually are. So you could see how the structure of information sharing and newsfeed selection could create pluralistic ignorance or false beliefs about how outraged others actually are in the network. So to test this possibility, we ran a series of field studies on Twitter that had an author phase and an observer phase. And in the author phase, we collected tweets in real time and classified their level of outrage using our digital outrage classifier. Then we sent direct messages to the authors of those tweets and asked them to rate how outraged and happy they felt when they sent the tweet. We then store those tweets in a database and the emotion ratings. And then in the observer phase, we show those tweets to a separate group of observers, and we ask them to judge how outraged and happy they think the author was when the author composed and sent the tweet. What we can then do is compare the author's actual emotion ratings with the predicted ratings from the observers. And what we find is that the observers consistently judge the authors to be more outraged than the authors themselves actually report feeling. And this effect is specific to outrage. We don't see this effect on the happiness ratings. So here are 3 replications. On the top, these are outrage ratings for observers and authors, and you can see that they're consistently higher for the observers. The bottom row is happiness ratings, and there's no difference between authors and observers for the happiness ratings. And strikingly, the overperception of outrage is stronger in observers who self-report more social media engagement with political content. So we next examine the consequences of over-perceiving outrage in a series of experiments. Our database contains tweets that vary in their levels of reported and perceived outrage. So what we can do is we can take these tweets and create 2 simulated news feeds where the level of actual outrage reported by the authors is held constant. But in the overperception news feed, observers are perceiving more outrage in those tweets than the authors report feeling. And in the accurate perception feed, observer and author ratings are matched. And so we randomly assign our participants to scroll through one of those feeds, and then we measure the effect on a variety of dependent measures related to affective polarization and intergroup conflict. So some of the things we find is that relative to the accurate perception condition, the overperception condition increases perceptions of collective outrage in the network, increases beliefs about norms of outrage expression in the network, exacerbates polarization. So the network is believed to have warmer feelings towards in-group members and colder feelings towards out-group members, with the effect size for out-groups nearly twice as large as for in-groups. And finally, increases beliefs about the network's ideological extremity. So I think I'm going to wrap up rather than go into our work on hate speech. I can actually just share the punchline, which is that there's a question of why perpetrators of hate speech online do it. And one reason that's been proposed is the idea that that they are morally motivated. So the basic idea is that perpetrators of network harassment and hate speech often feel justified in their behaviors. And so we describe this phenomenon as moralized hate speech. It's a type of morally motivated network harassment. And the worry is that to the extent that hate speech contains elements of moral outrage, because we know that moral outrage is amplified online, this may, as a side effect, accelerate the spread of hate speech. So we've done some analysis where we basically look at the overlap in outrage expressions and hate speech expressions using data sets that are already labeled for hate speech. And what we find is a really, really substantial overlap. It's about 60% of all cases of hate speech that we looked at. This seems to be specific for tweets that are labeled with hate speech. So just to conclude our consequences section and wrap things up so we can get to the Q&A. Outrage is an engine for the spread of disinformation and may cause people to share information without reading it first. Outrage expressions tend to be over-perceived online, which inflates beliefs about polarization and intergroup hostility. There's substantial overlap between outrage and hate speech, which means that engagement-based algorithms may facilitate the spread of hate speech online. And practically speaking, what this means is that the tools that we develop for detecting outrage expressions on social media might be helpful in rooting out these various forms of harmful content online. So in the last minute here, I'm just going to share a few thoughts, right? Technology companies really like to focus on the upsides of bringing people together in online social networks. They like to argue that their products provide neutral platforms for social behaviors, but don't actually change those behaviors. And I hope I've convinced you that our data are really not consistent with this claim. If moral outrage is a fire, social media is like gasoline. And it's also worth noting that social media platforms are indifferent to the types of outrage they amplify. The same algorithms that are promoting Black Lives Matter among progressives are at the same time promoting white supremacy amongst conservatives. And one consequence of this is that we lose our grip on the shared reality that's essential to a functioning democracy. And all the while, of course, social media companies are profiting from our collective outrage. Our work is sometimes misread as claiming that outrage is inherently bad and amplification of digital outrage is a problem because we should all just tone things down and get along and cooperate. And I want to be very clear that our work does not make this claim. There is a lot to be legitimately outraged about, and outrage channeled into activism has a really important place in our politics. And if you're interested in reading more about this, I'd really encourage you to read a recent book by the philosopher Maisha Cherry, who very eloquently argues for a particular type of rage. She calls it Lordian rage, after the activist Audre Lorde, describing it as a goal is to absorb anger and use it for energy, and anger has its benefits. Lordian rage is useful if it's focused with precision and translated into needed action. I think a question that we should be asking ourselves is, how much control do we want tech companies to have over our collective outrage? Are we okay with the fact that platform designers have the ability to influence the success or failure of social political movements by potentially algorithmically shaping our outrage expressions over time? There have been a lot of congressional hearings with tech company CEOs and a lot of empty promises to improve transparency and accountability for the problems of misinformation, hate speech, harassment, polarization, etc. We still have a long way to go to solve these problems. And our social science is progressing, but it's really challenging to do this kind of work because academics are just totally at the mercy of these companies. Our work is completely dependent on what data the companies are willing to share with us. And we have no way of verifying whether what they do share is representative or complete. It seems safe to assume that these companies have very little incentive to make it easy for researchers to uncover the ways in which their products might be harmful. And indeed, the Facebook papers showed that when Facebook made some discoveries themselves, they didn't disclose them to academics or the public. Now, there are a lot of really smart, dedicated people with very good intentions working on these problems in academia and also within the tech companies themselves. The problem, I think, is that current institutional incentives have really stacked the deck against us making progress. And so my hope is that we can imagine new and more effective models for doing this kind of work, because social media is not going away. And with advances in virtual reality and the arrival of the metaverse, it's likely to become even more pervasive in our daily lives. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and really want to thank my very, very talented team, especially Billy and Killian, who have just done such amazing work, and our funders, and all of you for your wonderful attention. So that is it for me. I see a question already about outrage responses to misinformation. Does it express anger over the fact that information was fake, or does it express anger over what is taken as information? We are looking in the Twitter data at responses to tweets that have links to fake news. So like the paradigmatic case is like someone posts a link to an article from one of these fake news sites, and then we're looking at outrage in the comments. So I assume that that's going to be anger in response to the headline, especially if people haven't read the headline.
That's a strong assumption, isn't it? Right?
So yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, these data are very limited, which is why we supplement our studies with lab experiments where we can directly probe what subjects' beliefs actually are. So this is one aspect of our approach that I think is really helpful, is that there are just limits to what you can infer from the social media data. And so the approach that we've developed in my lab has been to always supplement the observational studies with experiments. And so one thing that I didn't have time to show, but since you're bringing it up, is an experiment we did with the fake news studies. And we wanted to test whether headlines that provoke more or less outrage, that are either misinformation headlines or factually accurate news, differ in terms of their discernment of accuracy. So here what I'm plotting is subjects in an experiment are rating how accurate do you think this headline actually is. And so what you can see here is that for the factually accurate headlines, they're giving those higher accuracy ratings than the misinformation headlines. So people are actually discerning, right? And they are rating the outrage-provoking accurate headlines a little bit more accurately than lower outrage-provoking headlines. But one critical test is whether outrage-provoking headlines reduce discernment, right? Are they bringing the accuracy ratings down? And these data show that they're not. But we also collect alongside these intentions to share. And what we see is for both misinformation and factually accurate headlines, outrage in the headlines increases intentions to share equally strong for the misinformation and the factually accurate news. So your question is really good because it highlights the limitations of what we can infer from the social media data, which we can then pick up in the experiments.
Thank you.
So yes, we can either have things in the chat. We have Kristen in the chat. Have patterns according to gender shown up? Are there differences in perceptions of men and women's outrage in the digital world consistent with those perceived in the real world?
Love this question. So we have not looked at that question exactly because it's very, very difficult to discern the gender identity of social media users. Quite a lot of people don't put that in their profile. There's only so much you can infer from names. But one thing that we have looked at is whether men and women receive differential levels of outrage for the same moral violation. So unfortunately, I don't think I have a slide for this, but we have looked at, on Twitter, outrage directed towards people who don't wear masks, and looked specifically at whether women who don't wear masks or men who don't wear masks get targeted with more outrage. And the way that we do this in the social media text is looking at the coincidence of language about masks, language about outrage, and gendered pronouns. So what we're inferring from those data is if, tweets like, I'm so outraged that she didn't wear a mask versus I'm so outraged that he's not wearing a mask. Those are the types of tweets we're comparing. At the beginning of the pandemic, before the CDC recommended universal mask wearing, there was no difference in outrage targeted towards male versus female targets. After the CDC declared that you should be wearing masks, two things happened. One, women started wearing masks more than men. This was documented across a number of studies. So there was a higher expectation that women will wear masks than men will wear masks. This difference in expectations then creates different prediction errors when you're presented with a man versus a woman who's not wearing a mask. And because there's work connecting prediction errors to punishment and outrage, we predicted that women would be targeted with more outrage for not wearing masks than men, even though the behavior is the same, but because the expectations are different, then there's a higher prediction error for the woman who's not wearing a mask than relative to the man. And that's exactly what we find in our Twitter data. We've also been doing experiments with neuroeconomic games. So we show participants, male and female targets who choose to take money for themselves by inflicting pain on other people. And we find in those experiments as well that people expect men to behave more selfishly than women. And when the targets deviate from expectations, people punish the women more for deviations than the men. They also reward the women more for conforming to expectations than the men. So all of these findings are part of a larger project looking at how gendered moral expectations can lead to gender disparities in punishment. And I have Killian working on the social media side of this, and my other student, Mega, is doing an fMRI study, the idea being that we should be able to tie neural signals of prediction errors to the gender disparities of punishments.
Nikita, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or I can read it?
Oh, is there a question?
No, I can unmute and ask.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Crockett. That was
Hi.
a lovely talk. I was wondering about the kind of like the whole network that we become a part of once we join online. If my political position already impacts the kind of network I will become a part of, the kind of people and friends I will follow. And once I am online, is there like, what kind of movement happens between these networks, ideologically extreme and neutral?
Yes, great question. So I believe that there's evidence for both types of processes, right? So like homophily is a thing, like people join networks that are, have features that are similar to them, but also conformity and norm learning is a thing. So people tend to join groups that are ideologically similar to them, but also you can get sucked into groups that are more extreme than where you started. And in particular, there's some pretty troubling evidence that researchers have done on data from YouTube, I think in particular, where YouTube's algorithm, at least for some time, was like basically feeding people increasingly extreme content. Now that's of course at the level of content consumption as opposed to social networks, but the way that all of these algorithms work is they're optimizing for engagement, and they know that outrage and anger-provoking content keep people online longer, and so the algorithms are going to suggest that you join networks that have more of that content, and they're going to feed you more of that content and show you more of that content, and if you post that content, it's going to show that content to other people they expect will like it. And so it all sort of gets melded together.
Right, thank you.
I know that Kristen has another question. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Sure. Thank you for your talk, and thanks everyone. I just had another quick question about if you knew whether these algorithms that prioritized outrage for profit were specific to apps headquartered within the United States or within the UK. I was wondering about applications in like just ones I'm aware of, Douyin and Weibo and WeChat in China, or KakaoTalk in South Korea, and just are these algorithms like a global phenomenon, or is it more American focused?
I don't know the answer to that question. If I were to speculate, I would speculate that the answer is yes, just because moral outrage and punishment are demonstrated to be cross-cultural phenomena, and so the same principles that generate engagement along that part of our psychology in the US and UK, I would expect to also play a role in other parts of the world. I mean, some of the data that came to light in the Facebook papers concerned really troubling stuff that happened in Myanmar, facilitating violence towards Rohingya and facilitating hate speech and that spilled over, unfortunately, to violence in the real world. And yeah, I mean, computational social science is unfortunately very focused on the English-speaking world, and it's just like we have the weird problem in psychology, we also have it in computational social science, and it's particularly exacerbated because the natural language processing tools that are the most advanced are trained and built on English language corpora. So that's definitely an area for future improvement in the work.
Yeah, thank you.
I might take the moderator's prerogative to ask a question. I'm interested in those tweets that are judged by the person themselves to be, you equated them, right, for their own anger level, I believe. Mm-hmm. But they were perceived as differential. So you would have tweets that were equated for the sender's outrage, or, well, yes, right. And then, but the folks who were, viewing them, you had different sort of tweets that were judged to be higher or lower. So what makes them different? What is there something that's, is there some magnitude of, outrage or something? Yeah,
it's a good question. We haven't been able to look at that just because the size of a data set you would need to be able to extract the relevant features is not the size of the data set that we have. So the pipeline that we built to direct message Twitter users is, it's not a very high volume throughput. So, we're relying on people to respond to our direct message. So I think it's less than 10% of the people who we message get back to us. And, that potentially sets up some sort of selection bias in these data, although this same method has been used by other research groups, and they have done tests to look at sort of representativeness of who responds versus doesn't. And I think it's, certainly no worse than the type of people who participate in your typical psychology experiment. Yes, but what we have in these data sets is about maybe 500 tweets or so. And so we just don't have the volume that we could be able to extract features, but I would love to do that. I suspect that it would be at the word level. Like, I think there are probably some words like expletives, if I had to guess, that are associated with strong emotions, but a lot of people use casually, especially in an online setting, but that's just a totally wild guess.
Thank you again so much for our, for coming and presenting to us today. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and really great questions, very thought-provoking, and feel free to reach out by email if you have more questions later.